Pricing allocates the demand for resources. Competitive pricing allocates resources efficiently. This lecture will review how the demand for resources is determined, with labor as the primary focus. Yet the principles also apply to land, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. Here, we'll explain the significance of resource pricing. We'll convey how the marginal revenue productivity of a resource relates to a firm's demand for that resource. We're going to list the factors that increase or decrease resource demand and discuss the determinants of elasticity. Importantly, we will determine how a competitive firm selects its optimal combination of resources. In addition, we'll discuss how the optimal mix of labor and capital is determined. As you will recall from the circular flow model in Module 1, resource pricing determines the money income for households. Business makes payments to households for wages, rent on land, interest for lending money, and shares profit. And who pays businesses? Household consumers. Henry Ford, icon of the automotive industry, said it best. It's not the employer who pays wages. He only handles the money. It's the product that pays wages, and it's managements that arrange the production so that the product may pay the wages. Implied in Ford's statement is products and services that customers want. From the firm's perspective, the mix of resources purchased from households must be done in a way that minimizes the overall cost of producing the most output. The firm attempts to optimize the mix of resources. Product prices allocates finished goods and services to consumers. Resource pricing allocates resources among industries and firms. Government can allocate income to households by taxing and transfers. Thus, government policy does play a role in resource pricing. How do we determine the demand for resources? To start, let's assume a completely competitive market. That is, pure competition exists both in the product market and the resource market. We discover the demand for resources with two calculations. First, we determine the marginal product. Let's call that output of the resource that we will use. In this lecture, it's labor. But the calculation can be done for any resource that we would employ. The calculation of marginal product helps determine the productivity of the resource. Second, what's the market price of the product or service that we're trying to sell? What's the market value? These two factors in combination give us the derived demand for labor. The result is called the marginal revenue product. You can imagine that a highly productive labor force that produces a product that is highly valued would have a high marginal revenue product. Let's take a look at marginal revenue product. Typically, if we add more labor, we get more output. However, we need to know the value of the next person to be hired so that each individual addition does not produce the same output. Let me go back over that. As you add more and more labor to a fixed level of capital, each incremental person that's hired does not produce the same output as the previous people that are already employed. We're going to see that in a moment. The marginal revenue product, that is the change in total revenue resulting from a resource change, will give us direction on how many people to hire. The marginal revenue product is a change in total revenue resulting from a change in the resource input. So it's complex, and I'm going to show you that on a graph here, but it's just not all about wages. Wages are going to be determined by this calculation. In this example, it's the marginal revenue change the firm gets in the market resulting from a unit change in labor. If one additional worker can produce 5 units at a market price of $2, then the MRP is $10. So we have two things going on here. We have what the worker can produce, what that incremental worker can produce, and what that production gets in the market given the selling price of the product or service. And it just gives the example here down at the bottom of the page. Let's assume that one additional labor produces 5 additional units. And it's in the market, we're going to get $2 a unit. The MRP, the marginal revenue product for that worker, is $10. Now we have to look at the other side, the marginal resource cost. When we add more labor, we also get more cost. The marginal resource cost is the change in the total resource cost resulting from a unit change in resource input. Again, in this case, labor. This will determine our wage rate. We have two things working here: marginal revenue product, marginal resource cost. Are the two concepts related? Yes. Firms don't hire additional people unless they make additional money. A firm in a competitive market will hire labor up to the point where marginal revenue product equals the marginal revenue cost, and not beyond this point. Otherwise, they just add cost without getting anything for it. Stated differently, to maximize profit, firms hire additional resources as long as the additional product produced adds more to revenue than to cost. The MRP schedule equals the firm's demand for labor. The MRC is the wage rate. In a competitive market, the firm hires workers up to the point at which the market wage rate is equal to its MRP. These concepts are more easily understood with a table. Looking at the bottom, we see a downward sloping demand curve for labor in a competitive market. At a wage rate of $8, the firm will hire 4 workers. Wage rate on the vertical axis, quantity of resource demanded on the horizontal axis. However, let's come at it from another direction. How much a firm can make by adding workers to its process. Let's assume the market demand for the firm's product is 22 units. Column 1 represents the units of labor the firm can hire. Column 2 represents the output that can be produced with the firm's existing process, meaning the existing capital process. So we're just adding labor here as the incremental input. Column 3 is the marginal product, or the incremental output that can be made with each resource addition. As we can see here, the first resource has a marginal product of 7. You add 1, the second one has a marginal product of 6, and so on a decreasing scale. The 2 workers, 1 and 2, can make 13 units, but the second worker only adds 6 units to production. The third worker adds 5 units, and the fourth worker adds 4 units. Given the marginal product, the firm will hire 4 workers to produce the 22 units, the market demand. And I've highlighted those here in blue. You can see that the total output of the 4 workers is 22, equals the market demand. Won't hire any more. There's no sense in hiring the 5th worker to make 25 because the market demand is 22. And this tells you then, given the marginal product, how many workers the firm is going to hire. Column 4 represents the market price the firm can sell for. Because it is a competitive market, it can only get $2 per unit no matter how much is produced. Taking the production output, which equals their market demand, and multiplying by the market price, we get the total revenue of the firm of $44. Column 6 shows us the marginal revenue product, or how much each worker adds to revenue. It represents the demand curve for labor, as shown at the bottom graph. In this case, MRC equals MRP at a wage rate of 8. What would happen if the wage rate, let's assume the minimum wage rate was 10. The fourth worker would cost more than what the firm could get in the market from the output. The MRC would be greater than the MRP, and the firm would not produce at that level. So this is really the calculation that determines the demand for labor in a competitive market. How much each incremental worker can produce, column 3, given that incremental marginal product, how much is the total product or total output? And at the market demand of 22, the marginal revenue product, given that we can only get $2 per unit, the marginal revenue product is 8. And we can compare that directly on the bottom graph that says, well, at a wage rate of 8, I'm going to hire 4 workers. This brings the output of the individual and the realities of the market together to determine what the overall demand for labor is. Let's take a look now a little differently at an imperfectly competitive market. The results are different in a market that is imperfectly competitive, where the firm sets the market price. Thus, to sell more, the firm has to lower its price. So here we have the exact same kind of table as we had in the competitive market, columns 1 through 6. Units of resources, the total output, the marginal product, the product price. And here we're concentrating on column 4, which says in an imperfectly competitive market, in order to sell more volume, I've got to lower the price. It's the only way I can get more. Thus, in an imperfectly competitive market, 2 factors reduce wages. Let's assume they want to sell the 22 units like the competitive firm. So we're not changing market demand here, okay? At all. The marginal product of the fourth worker is 4, as shown in column 3. And the price falls to $2 per unit as output increases to the 22. A little different happens here in the imperfectly competitive market, or the imperfect competitive market. The lower market price accompanying each increase in output applies not only to the marginal product of the additional worker, but to all the other output that could have been sold at the higher price. That's the key here. You need to walk through and understand what I could get at 18 units and 3 workers selling at $220, generating a total revenue of $39.60 and having a marginal revenue product of $840. If I need to sell those additional 22 units, I now need to sell all 22, not at a lower price of 0.2, 220 to 2. I need to sell all those 22 units at $2. So I could have made $39.60, but the amount that I can make by selling those 4 additional units and making the 44, I have to, in essence, discount all of the other 18 units in order to move the total volume at the end of the day. Thus, the MRP of the third worker is shown at 840 in column 6. The MRP of the fourth worker is only 440, as shown on the bottom right. It's the $8 earned by selling the additional 4 units at the $2 market price, less the 20 cents a unit on the previous 18 units produced. So in the bottom right here, you can see that we start with 8 and we have to subtract the $3.60 to get to an MRP of 4.4. And you want to be able to walk through this table. It's definitely going to be a test question to understand exactly what happens to both the total revenue and the marginal revenue product in an imperfectly competitive market where the firm wants to sell additional units beyond the 18. What are the conclusions? This example highlights that an imperfectly competitive firm's resource demand curve is less elastic than a firm operating in a perfectly competitive market. And we can see that here in the graph down at the bottom. The pure competition is shown by that dotted line, but in an imperfectly competitive world, in order to hire the same amount of labor, we will have a wage rate that is much less, the difference between 8 and 4. The imperfectly competitive firm does not expand the quantity of labor it employs by as large a percent than the perfectly competitive firm for a given decline in the wage rate. This is just another example of allocated inefficiencies of imperfect competition. And it's all driven by the fact that in a perfectly competitive world, the firm goes in and sells at $2. It knows it can sell at $2. Its demand is 22 and it has a wage rate. In this particular case, they can alter what they sell depending upon how much they want to lower the price, and it clearly influences the marginal revenue product and therefore the wage rate that it is prepared to pay. It is important to understand what alters the demand for a resource. We know that the demand curve is downward sloping for a given resource. However, what shifts the demand curve for a resource to the right or left? An increase or decrease in demand, not the quantity demanded. Let's think of our labor example. First, a change in the product or service that's being produced. If demand increases for smartphones, then the labor to produce smartphones will increase. Second, on the input side, changes in productivity of the resource. The ability to make more with the same level of resources. The greater the amount of capital and land resources used with labor, the greater will be labor's marginal productivity and thus the demand for labor. Technological advances lower the overall cost curve and improve output. Dock workers employed with a specific amount of high-tech unloading cranes are more productive than dock workers with the same amount of real capital used in an old conveyor belt system. Finally, the quality of the hiring process changes the productivity of labor's input, as does training. Thus, the demand for labor is influenced by the factors affecting MRP and MRC. There are two other factors that can alter the demand for resources. One, changes in the price of substitute resources. Up until this point, we have just talked about labor. Okay? But in the real world, we have to understand the labor capital mix. Changes in the price of substitute resources, the substitution effect. Capital, in the firm's quest for the lowest cost output, is a substitute for labor. A substitute resource for U.S. labor may be found in China. But a factor that has just as much impact is the relative price of capital. So if the relative price of capital goes down as compared to the labor price, then more capital will be consumed relative to labor to produce the output. Pretty simple to think of. You have two buckets. You have a labor cost bucket and you have a capital cost bucket. And how much the relative price of those two buckets change influences the mix of labor and capital that you bring to produce a given level of output. Okay, wages go up from $30 an hour to $50 an hour. You can be sure that management will be looking at, and therefore the relative cost of labor has gone up relative to capital. You could be assured that management is looking at substituting capital for labor in one form or another, either moving to China, moving to Mexico, or buying much more efficient equipment because they can now, given the fact that labor has increased their price. Okay, so it's the relative price of capital and labor that's known as the substitution effect. There's also an output effect. That is, the more that is produced to get economies of scale, which allows you to operate at a lower average total cost, the more resources are going to be demanded. In practice, the substitution effect and the output effect actually happen at the same time. And the net effect on resource pricing is the interplay of both of these factors. Second, there could be changes in the price of complementary resources. Just think of a graphic design house. A decline in the price of computers, capital, may get them to purchase more computers. Given that computers require a graphic designer to operate them, the decline in the price of computers leads to an increase in the demand for labor, a complementary resource change. Okay, so I think most of what you need to concentrate on is the changes in the price of substitute resources. The changes in the price of complementary resources is an interesting example, but in practice, the balance between the relative cost of labor and the relative cost of capital are probably the most significant, and therefore the substitution effect and the output effect is really what you ought to concentrate on. This is an excellent chart to review for a quiz or a test because it really summarizes the concept of the mix of capital and labor to produce a given level of output, or the mix of labor and capital used in a project. It summarizes what happens to the demand for labor when there is an increase in the cost or price of capital. When there is an increase in the price of capital, column A shows that the substitution effect, more labor is used proportionately. However, the increase in the cost of capital has increased the overall cost of the project or output, and the output effect would be that less capital and labor are used in total. The net effect shown in column C depends if the substitution effect is greater or less than the output effect. That's the key learning here. So you need to understand the substitution effect of labor and capital versus the output effect. And therefore, what's the combined effect given the proportions? And this is an excellent chart to review prior to any quiz or test on this particular subject. Not everybody wins in the labor business. The demand for labor goes up, but it goes down as well. Through 2020, these highlighted jobs will decline due to a combination of imported products substituting domestic products, like shoes and clothes, and technological change, let's call that a decrease in the relative cost of capital, affecting groups like post office workers. People are sending their mail through the internet. Capital. The relative cost of capital has decreased significantly relative to the wage rate of postal workers. As an aside, you would also expect a complementary good, like pens, to also show a decrease in demand, given that nobody's actually writing letters anymore. Recently, there has been a considerable amount of reporting on the decline in retail sales clerks as more and more people use capital, the internet, to do their shopping. To close out this lecture, we're going to review resource mix. This is probably one of the most important pieces of the lecture, to singularly look at the demand for labor in a real-world market without understanding these relative proportions that I've talked about, doesn't give you real-world practicality. So what I'm going to try to do in the last portion of this lecture is to discuss, well, what is the optimal combination of resources and what are the measures that I can use to determine if I'm using the optimal combination of resources. What combination of resources will minimize cost at a specific output level? Well, let's look at the least cost rule. It's a concept that tries to balance two equations: the marginal product of labor and the marginal product of capital, where the last dollar spent on each resource yields the same marginal product. Okay? So, there's another: what combination of resources will maximize profit? The profit maximizing rule helps us to estimate this combination. Okay. So we have two ways of doing it: the least cost combination of resources and the profit maximizing combination of resources. And we're going to take a look at these individually in the remaining slides. Least cost rule. The last dollar spent on each resource yields the same marginal product. So on the left, we have the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor. And on the right, we have the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. That's the equation. It's complex to think of this in relative terms because you're really balancing here four numbers without seeing an example. So let's take a look at an example. Let's describe this example at the bottom left portion of this chart. Assume that the price of both capital and labor is $1 per unit, and the firm employs each at the current level that yields a marginal product of labor of 10 and a marginal product of capital that is less at 5. At this mix of resources, the equation does not balance because, as I shown in the equation above, the least cost rule demands that the equations balance. What is a manager to do? Well, first, it says my equation does not balance. Thus, I am not operating at the lowest long-run cost for a given level of output. Key here is the long run, because you can shift these resources the next day. So that's why I do a starting point here. You show that at the starting point, the equations are not in balance given the price of labor, price of capital, and the marginal product of each. So I want to adjust my mix because I can do that in the long run. Okay, so what would an owner do? Because labor can produce more for each dollar of cost, it would begin to add more labor and reduce capital. What happens? By continuing to add more labor, we reduce the marginal product of labor. At the same time, increasing the price, the marginal product of capital. Remember, let's take a time out here. The marginal product curves for each have diminishing returns with additions, and they have increases with subtractions. So as we add more labor, we will diminish the marginal product of labor from 10 to 7 in the long run adjustment. And as we diminish capital, we will increase the marginal product of capital from 5 to 7. So we would continue to make that shift until our marginal product of capital and the marginal product of labor are the same. So that adding one more unit of labor gets 10 units of production. Deducting 1 unit of capital loses 5 units, but the net is 5. The net is plus 5, and my equation is now in balance. So you can see here, again, you have to understand the concept that there's diminishing returns in the marginal product. The least you have, the more you subtract, the marginal product goes up. The more you add, the marginal product goes down. The firm will continue to adjust the mix until the equations balance at an MP for both of 7. Then they know that they're operating at the lowest cost mix. So what's important here? What's important on the learning is to be able to conceptually understand the diminishing returns of product. And if you were given a situation of a starting point with this type of information in it, you would at least be able, without doing the math, you would at least be able to determine what is the lowest cost rule, what is the lowest cost approach in terms of the mix of capital and labor, and you would do that knowing that the definition requires that the two equations be equal. That's the least cost rule. More importantly is the profit maximizing rule. Minimizing cost is not necessarily sufficient for maximizing profit. In a purely competitive market, the marginal resource cost is equal to the resource price. This condition must hold for every variable resource. Here we see 2. The price of labor equals the MRP of labor, and the same for capital. By dividing each MRP by its price, we get the competitive equation where both equal 1. So it's a little bit different equation. Not only do they both need to equal in the profit maximizing rule, they need to both equal 1. When that happens and that particular equation happens, we know we have established the profit maximizing point. That's the rule. Let's take a look at an example. Okay, starting point again. In the starting point example at the bottom of the chart, both equations are the same, right? In both instances, the equations equal 3. The MRP of labor divided by the price of labor, 3, and the MRP of capital divided by the price of capital also equals 3. So they equal. Not sufficient. they must both equal 1 to know whether you are maximizing profit or not. Thus, the firm is underemploying both capital and labor. The firm can expand its profit by hiring additional amounts of both capital and labor until it moves down its downward sloping MRP curves to the point where the MRP of labor equals 5 and the MRP of capital equals 3. And in that particular case, both equations equal 1. Okay, so you are changing both the mix and the additions in order to maximize your profit. To conclude, a firm can meet the conditions of the least cost rule and not be operating at maximum profit. However, if they are maximizing profit, as shown here, then they must be using the least cost combination of resources to do so. So really, it's the profit maximizing rule that's the most important to understand, because once you are maximizing profit, by definition, you are operating at the least cost. No other combination of resources will give you a lower cost position. Okay. I would review these calculations as they will be on the quiz and the exam. If you have questions, just give me a call. I'll be happy to walk through the calculations with you. But here you can see both the starting point and the adjustment, and that both equations do equal 1 by changing the MRP of labor and MRP of capital so that they do both equal 1. Let's conclude with a more specific example. Here we have a situation where the price of labor is $8 per unit and the price of capital is $12 per unit. We can see labor on the left, 8, capital on the right. So we're going to initially calculate the least cost rule with a little more complex example. So what we want to find is to find the least cost at producing 50 units of total output, given that the labor price is 8 and the capital price is 12 per unit. The marginal products and marginal revenue products for each resource input are shown. Same table as we've seen before. Total quantity of labor input in the first column, total output in the second column, the marginal product of the additional labor in the third column, total revenue in the fourth column, and the marginal revenue product in the fifth column for labor. The same is also true for capital, the exact same combination, okay? Let's assume that the firm wanted to produce 50 units of total production using both methods. A labor method and a capital method in combination. What's the lowest cost method for producing the 50 units? Well, we need to go back to our least cost rule, where we need to divide and I've done this for you at the bottom of the chart, where the marginal product of labor at 6 and the price of labor is at 8, and therefore that equation equals 3/4. That on the right-hand side, the marginal product of capital is 9. The price of capital is at 12 or at 3/4, and therefore we know, based upon our least cost rule equation where they must equal, that we are operating at the least cost if we want to use output of labor and capital. No other combination will give you the least cost. Here's the important point. It may not give you the most profit. So I want to conclude on this. The answer of finding the least cost of 50 units of total output, 28 and 22, the answer is in blue here as you move across the page. The answer is 3 units of labor and 2 units of capital. No other combination of labor and capital will generate a lower cost. If you take 3 units of labor, the cost is 24. Likewise, 2 units of capital at 12 is 24. The total cost is 48. There are other combinations of resources that will generate 50 units of output, but none of them will do it at a lower cost than $48. Again, we can test this by just plugging in any different marginal product of labor and the price of labor, or any change in the marginal product of capital given the price of capital, and we will never get to those equations balancing at 3/4 each. Will not happen given the information. The MP of labor is 6 divided by the price. Okay, and therefore the equations are in balance. Bingo, we've achieved our objective. Well, not quite, because the 50 units of output given this mix would not meet our profit maximizing rule. Why? Because they don't equal 1. So we've accomplished one objective in our mix of labor and capital, but we have not accomplished the ultimate objective, which is profit maximization. So let's take a look at that. $50 units of output does not maximize profit. So here we are sitting in a company. We show management that we're operating at the least cost that we can have in the combination of capital and labor. And management says, great. And then somebody raises their hand and asks the question, but are we maximizing profit? What about the profit maximizing rule? Everybody kind of looks dumbfounded and goes back to work and realizes that 50 units of output does not maximize profit. Same labor price, same capital price. Okay. So we want to get to the situation where the equation balances and equals 1. And there is only one spot on this chart that does that, where the MRP of labor divided by the price of labor equals 1, and that the MRP of capital at 12 and the price of capital equals 12. And that is when you produce an output of 65 units. So they would have to run back to management and say, well, no, we need to increase labor in a certain proportion, and we need to increase capital in a certain proportion in order to meet the profit maximizing objective. When this expansion is completed, the firm will have a labor MRP divided by a labor price of 1 and a similar calculation for capital. Profit is maximized. And here is the added benefit if you go back and do the least cost equation on this output. Here's the added benefit. The input cost also meets the lowest cost rule. The MP divided by the P of labor is 1/2. Remember, it's marginal product for the least cost rule. Okay, so go take a look at this chart in the PowerPoint slides and go back, and you will see that when you divide the MP by the P of labor, by the marginal product of labor by the price of labor, it's 1/2. And you will get the same number for capital of 1/2. So once you meet the profit maximizing rule again, as I've stated on the previous charts, you hit the lowest cost rule by definition. Industrial engineers and economists spend countless hours trying to organize the data that we have reviewed. When you have a test, you won't be expected to go off and accumulate the data. I'll give that to you. But it's important to understand two things. The MRP equals MRC concept, the initial part of this lecture, and the least cost and profit maximizing rules in the second half of the lecture, and study them. From a practical application as business leaders, you're going to want to know, hey, are we maximizing the profits of the firm given the mix of labor and capital that we are employing? That's the job of business leaders.